Hello there and welcome to Bo Beats. My name is Bo and today we're taking a look at the Launchpad X. They sent one over for me to test, which is a lot of fun because I've never used a Launchpad before. So in today's video I'm gonna go over exactly what it is, what it can do, all the new features, because even though you've seen a Launchpad before and it looks sort of like their previous generations, there's a lot of new features in this one. So we're gonna go over all of that, and as a little bonus, I will also talk about a sort of hidden or bonus feature, which will make all hardware synth lovers a little bit more excited about this controller. And it's the fact that you can use this controller to control hardware synths either via Ableton Live, or if you have a USB MIDI hub, you can actually take this and use it standalone together with hardware synths. It's sort of a bonus feature, I guess. And if you want to see more about that, stick around till the end of the video because I'm gonna go over it and show you proof of concept. So let's start with a bit of an overview. The basic idea here is that you use the Launchpad to launch clips inside of Ableton, and we can see a representation of the clips in my song here, and you can move through the tracks and up and down. So this is a graphical representation here on the pads of each individual track and each clip on the track. For example, then over here we have the session button, which you can toggle. And you can also long press it. If we long press it, we get access to a menu where we can change stuff as the LED settings here, the brightness of the LEDs. We can change the velocity response, after touch, and how the fader responds to velocity as well. We'll get to that in a minute. When session is green, we can launch clips and move between different scenes. So for example, but if we press session again, we get access to the mixer controls, volume, panning, send A and B, stop clip, mute, solo, and record arm. So let's stop the clips. Under volume, we have a nice little representation here of the different tracks' volumes, and we can of course scroll through them. Under panning, it's the same. So we have the tracks here, you can pan them. And you might have noticed something, and that is that the pads are velocity sensitive. That's a new feature, and you can actually use this to do slower fades. So for example, if I want to fade the volume slowly, I can just drag it like this, or gently tap it. And if I want it to happen very quickly, hit it hard. This velocity sensitivity for the faders can also be turned off. We also have sends. We can also mute clips, we can solo them. Oh, and another small but possibly useful feature is that you can actually tap the pad to make small changes in smaller increments. So for example, if I just press like this, of course we'll be jumping a lot in volume, but if I use tapping multiple times like this will make the volume go up in smaller increments. And we can record arm. And this was actually something that I was curious about, like how to actually switch tracks using this. So with record arm, I can switch between different tracks here. Which brings us to note mode, which is a new addition to the Launchpad X. It's a new mode, a dedicated mode to play chromatically. And also you can long press it to get access to the setup for the scales. Down here we have a selection of scales. If you're familiar with the Novation circuit, it's basically the same thing. And if we select a scale, we can actually use this keyboard to transpose it from C to D, for example. Now this button over here lets us enable or disable the scale basically for the note mode. So let's enable it and go back. Now you can see we have a scale. But let's say you don't want to use two hands. Well, we can go back here into the setup mode, and here we can select on how many rows we want the scale to be represented. Let me show you, it's easy if I show you. So let's take 3, for example. Let's go back. Suddenly we're representing the scale on these three. So for example, or we could just change it back to 2, say. Now before we move on, I want to show you something else that's very handy. So say you want to play drums instead. Well, if you've loaded a drum rack, the Launchpad here notices this and creates this little grid here. And I just played a few notes here, and let's say I want to capture that. Well, Ableton has a nifty feature called Capture MIDI that I'm sure you're aware of. If I long press this button here, I suddenly have a clip, because this button here both works as an overdub function. So if I just press it once like this, it lights up, I can overdub. And if I long press it, it will actually create a clip of whatever I was playing. So that's the Capture MIDI function. I don't really know how long it captures. So say I want to overdub, I just press Capture MIDI. But while you can capture MIDI, it's important to note that you don't have access to a metronome. You do not have the ability to quantize from the unit itself. I had to go over to the computer to do this. You can't double clips and stuff like that. That's all on the Launchpad Pro or Push 2. Now we've come to the custom mode, which I think is the most exciting thing with this little MIDI controller. Under custom, you have access to 4 pages of basically whatever you want it to be, within limits. So you have 4 user pages that you can set up yourself using components, and we'll take a look at how to do that on a computer. So now we're inside of component, and it's the software that Novation uses to access your synths and your MIDI controllers and set up stuff and exchange presets and so on. Now there's a lot of stuff going on here. We're just going to create a custom mode template here. Here's the default view. And on the right side here, we have widgets. So widgets are for different functions. So for example, we can just drag and drop a fader like this, or a vertical bipolar fader like this. And if we want to change the settings for it, press it. Here we can set CC number and MIDI channel. And we can of course also change the color. We also have horizontal faders as well as a chromatic keyboard. And you will notice here, when I drag the keyboard, the other ones turn red. This is because you can't have a vertical fader and a keyboard. We also have MIDI note buttons that lets you play a note, say C, certain octave. We also have a drum grid, program change, so program number, MIDI channel, CC button. So basically we could create a keyboard and a couple of horizontal faders like this, and a bunch of CC buttons, for example. And then we could send it to Launchpad, select for example number 3, and if we go in here on the Launchpad to number 3, you can see the setup that we created. You can even see that when I play this, it responds to the MIDI notes because it's the same. And then we have our faders. Next up, let me show you a sort of bonus feature of this Launchpad X. You can use it as a controller for your hardware synths, standalone, sort of, if you have a MIDI USB hub, that is. So that was just a little proof of concept. You can actually use the custom modes on this device together with hardware synths. So let me explain how. You can either set up custom controls that you use together with Ableton to send MIDI to a hardware synth like the NT1. What's even more interesting for hardware synth lovers is that if you have a USB MIDI hub. Now, what is that? Well, it basically lets you power your device, because this doesn't have external power, and translate the MIDI data sent over USB to DIN MIDI going into the Korg. So you can connect something like this Launchpad X together with any hardware synth. Then you can simply set up custom controls for that particular synth. So it's not a feature really that they're promoting, because it's an Ableton controller after all. But if you're an Ableton user, if you have use for a Launchpad, and you also have hardware synths, know that if you get a USB MIDI hub, you can use this to control hardware synths. You can have multiple custom controls. So what kind of controls do I have set up here? Well, I have a little keyboard. I also have filter cutoff. And resonance. I also have two LFO controls. As well as shape for the oscillator. And adding a sub. You will need a USB MIDI hub. This one here is discontinued. I would look at something from RetroKits or maybe Kenton. So, proof of concept, very interesting way of using this little controller. Anyone following the channel knows that I'm a beginner when it comes to Ableton. So what's my beginner perspective on the Launchpad X? And how does it stack up against something like the Push 2? Well, my first impression is that the Launchpads are definitely more geared towards performance. You don't really have that sort of control that you have with the Push. So obviously the Push is more geared towards studio use, and the Launchpad series a little bit more geared towards live performance. I really like the design of the unit, and the whole pads with the lights is very reminiscent of something like the Novation circuit that I've used a lot. And come to think of it, when I compare something like the Push 2 and the Launchpad, it sort of makes me think about the difference between a circuit and say some Electron unit. You know, with the added screen you have more control, but without the screen and primarily using colors as visual feedback, it becomes sort of a less cerebral activity, I'd say. And there's something intuitive with using pads and lights to control things. And you could of course just use it as a MIDI controller for Ableton, but it does bring me to not negatives, because I don't really think that there's any big negatives about the product. However, I think there are limitations. So for example, the lack of quantization directly available from the unit, you can't double patterns, there's no undo or delete functionality really from the unit itself. These are functions that you might want and might miss on a unit like this, so give that some thought before you go and buy anything. However, for the money and with the included software, because there's a pretty extensive software package that you get with this unit, I think it's a really interesting product if this is what you need and want. So go and check it out if you want to, and I hope you enjoyed today's little review, and if you did, hit the thumbs up, consider subscribing to the channel, and I hope to see you in the next video. Thank you so much. Hi, hello. This is an important service announcement about how you can help the channel. The videos and live streams do not magically appear. It's a lot of hard work. It's about a full-time job for me every single week. So if you feel like supporting what I do, go to Patreon. It's linked in the description. You can donate a small sum every month to keep the channel going and make it possible for me to make even more and better content. But I don't make any promises that I won't spend all the money on coffee. I mean, I won't, so support my coffee addiction, my synth videos over at patreon.com/bobeats.